expecting Commissioner Peng, as far as I know. Commissioner Javandel will be absent.
See? Glad you made it. All right, with all of the expected commissioners present, let's call the meeting to order. Roll call.
Commissioner Bynes.
Present.
Commissioner Chomsky.
Present.
Commissioner McCroskey.
Present.
Commissioner Peng.
Present.
Chair V. Hill McClanahan.
Present.
And Commissioners Javandel and Von Neidingen are absent.
All right. Now, the land acknowledgement. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupied the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Lishan. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt that is owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home. I guess now we are open for public comment for anything that is not on the agenda this evening. Doesn't look like anyone's present in person. Is there anyone holding up their hand online?
We do have someone online. If you would like to speak on an item not on the agenda, please use the raise your hand feature. Not seeing a hand raised.
All right. Let's move on to the presentation portion.
Thank you, Chair. First presentation is the monthly police data reports, and this is presenting for the months of July and August. There were 0 pedestrian-involved collisions for both months. There was 1 bike-involved collision reported in each of the 2 months. There were 7 total collisions reported in July and 5 in August, and of those collisions, 3 were injury collisions in July and 1 in August. There were 62 citations issued in July and 50 in August, and 4 DUI arrests were made in July and 3 in August. That concludes the police data report.
Shared mobility. Go into the shared mobility data, or
You want to take both presentations and then ask if there's any questions or comments?
Yeah, sorry. Is there any questions about the police data report? Sorry, it's been been 2 months.
No worries.
Out of the swing of things.
Again, if you wish to speak on the police data report, use the raise your hand feature if you're online. Not seeing a hand raised. Any commissioner comment, or should I proceed to the second presentation? Presentation is on shared mobility data. We are still waiting on data from VIO, but have quarterly data from GIG. GIG car share showed 1,144 members in the April through June quarter, with 1,403 trip starts and 1,435 trip ends in Albany. And again, they've notified their members and us that they are planning to end operations as of December 27th, end of the year. And that concludes the shared mobility report.
questions?
Any questions?
Do we know what they're doing in the rest of the Bay Area?
They are closing their service in both the Seattle market and the Bay Area. It's not just Albany service area, but their operations entirely.
It was an experiment. They were fully owned by AAA.
Yeah.
And I think they decided it was a failed experiment, that they couldn't raise prices anymore, and they couldn't make a profit without raising any prices. You remember us for a while. It was useful, but then service levels began declining, and I think that they just sort of, entered a downward spiral of lowering quality. And this is all my personal opinion as a user rather than as a commissioner, that they entered this downward spiral of no one wanted to pay for price increases and nobody wanted, and then they needed price increases to increase service quality.
It's a bummer. I was in Vancouver in February and it worked really well.
Yeah.
Maybe there's just a critical density you have to get above. But we weren't quite there.
Do they just let the cars roam free autonomously after that?
I think you will be able to purchase an extremely well-used Prius
With a bike rack?
for quite cheap, for fairly shortly.
Does it come with a turkey?
You have to get your own.
All right, do we have any other questions? Do we have any public questions on this shared mobility data?
Any public comment on this item, please use the raise your hand feature for the shared mobility data report. Not seeing a hand raised.
Is there any further desire for discussion of this item?
It was nice while it lasted.
It was very, very convenient while it lasted. All right. Let's go on to item 4, the minutes. Approval of the minutes, rather.
Do you want to ask for edits and public comment, and then we can make a motion if nobody says anything?
Sure. All right. Do we have any emendations to the minutes for last? I don't even remember when we had that meeting. July.
The July meeting. Yeah.
July meeting or public comment on that?
Not seeing a hand raised.
I move that we approve the consent calendar.
Second?
Roll call. Commissioner Barnes,
Yes.
Commissioner Chomsky,
Yes.
Commissioner McCroskey,
Yes.
Commissioner Peng,
I was absent.
abstain, and Chair Vigil McClanahan.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right. On to item 5.1. Citywide curb ramp design guidelines.
Should be little musical chairs, music. I'm a little punchy tonight, I'm sorry. More fun.
All right, good evening. My name is James Sorelli. For those who may be unfamiliar, I'm an associate engineer with the Public Works Department. And tonight I'm here to talk about something we've been working on internally for a bit now, our curb ramp design guidelines. But before I get into that, I just want to briefly go back a little bit on the background regarding curb ramps and ADA. So back in 1990, the ADA was passed, prohibiting discrimination based on disability. And the U.S. Access Board is the one that develops and maintains criteria for the right-of-way. So, in terms of curb ramp, prescriptive slopes and things like that. What's the maximum grade on a sidewalk? The U.S. Access Board was the one to design that. However, it took them until 1999 to actually publish a draft public right-of-way accessibility guidelines, which then took another 24 years to issue the final rule on it, which my guess will become enforceable in 2025. So that's over 30 years. Probably it's going to be about 35 years formally, without any formal federal requirements since ADA was passed. So that left state and local governments left to kind of determine what does accessibility compliance look like in the right-of-way. There were the draft guidelines, but there was no actual enforceable standard because they were just a draft. So a lot of that uncertainty ended up in court, and they determined the requirements. And it just was a bit of a patchwork of what were the guidelines. How do we design in the right-of-way for ADA? And as of 2025, hopefully it'll be very explicit and enforceable. Ultimately, the U.S. Access Board, when we do any kind of major alteration in the right-of-way, curb ramps are required at corners. And to kind of just talk a little bit about project life cycles in general, it should be kind of obvious, but we want to finish any design modifications during the design phase. We don't really want to change design unless it comes, if there's some kind of unforeseen technical issue, like we dig up a utility that was unknown and we have to work around it. And there's a few reasons we don't want to do any kind of modifications after design. You're talking about significant cost increases, risk and dispute issues escalate, especially with the contractor. And it's generally just not as feasible without additional funding and time. I mean, we were locked into a contract, for example, in the construction phase. You can't just tell them to hold on, we need another month or two to work something out. So the intent of the curb ramp design guidelines is to kind of help formalize and streamline a lot of that project delivery with curb ramps. So it will become a formal reference for city staff and consultants, and its ultimate purpose is to, generally describe site constraints when we're working in the right-of-way. What are the site constraints that need to be considered when we're designing for curb ramps? Generally summarize the ADA and PROAG requirements. Summarize, and this one's a bit more important for tonight, summarize the City of Albany's discretionary preferences. These were recommendations from the Transportation Commission on curb ramps. And ultimately, providing guidelines and a methodology for selecting preferred curb ramp types and details. So there is a lot I need to get through to set this up and to talk through these preferences. We're going to start with, constraints and requirements. What needs to be considered during design and what must be part of a curb ramp? And then we'll go to discretionary preferences and design toolbox. The preferences in particular is where, we're kind of looking for any further comments and confirming some of these preferences with the commission. So discretionary preferences, and when I say that, what are the preferences that Transportation Commission in particular, as the right-of-way reviewer for these kind of designs, what have they kind of directed staff to look at? Our design toolbox is just informally some of the things we include with curb ramp design regarding safety and aesthetics to try and formalize our designs. And then that'll lead to what our curb ramp selection methodology is. Weighing all these requirements and preferences, here's how we select a curb ramp at a given corner. And then looking forward, just real briefly, the curb ramp design guidelines are intended to be a living document. So looking forward is a few things that may affect the document in the long term. So with that, I'm going to jump in constraints and requirements. And at any time, if there's questions, feel free to stop me. So there's a lot of different constraints that affect the feasibility of installing a certain curb ramp at a corner. Some of the common ones here are topography, the surface water storm flow, drainage, right-of-way availability, just how much space we have to work with, adjacent land use and pedestrian circulation path. This is basically, how are pedestrians using that space so that when we alter it, we're not creating some kind of a negative impact or a hazard. Utility conflicts, sight distance, in particular, how is a pedestrian seen from a motorist point of view to make sure that they're visible and it's a safe crossing. Corner radius, crosswalks, and then San Pablo has some Caltrans constraints. So I'm going to go over a few of these in a bit more detail because they're generally the more important ones and have larger effects. One of the major ones being topography. Hilly areas require some exceptions to, maybe preferred curb ramps, because we need to balance a few things: accessibility, safety, drainage, road design, that are more tricky in irregular topography. So when you're working with crosswalks and curb ramps, there's very prescriptive grades and cross slopes, even if there's pretty extreme grades in the roadway. So you can imagine in this area, we're flattening out that crosswalk. How are we designing it to make sure that the motorist is also driving in a safe manner? They're not suddenly jolted. This is not as great of an example because it's a four-way stop, but we do have many cross streets here that, in one direction, two directions, they're not stopping. And it being a hill, drainage is more of a concern. So water typically, it will go from the high to a low point, just physics. So if you're introducing a very sharp slope, it's going to move down that hill a lot faster. So you can imagine a fast flow is more likely to run up a ramp. If it's moving fast enough and pooling in a certain spot, it can get over a curb quicker. And there's just a higher potential if you're not thinking about drainage in that it may end up flooding back of sidewalks and get into property. So it's a lot trickier on a hill. And kind of with that in mind, drainage is a constraint regardless of where you are. Hills just make it much more difficult. So here's a cross-section of a typical right-of-way. So you have sidewalks, potentially a planter strip, and then a curb, and then in the middle is your road. Roadways are typically designed, especially in Albany, with a crown. So that's a high point in the road so that water flows into the low point of the road, the gutters. And that curb kind of acts like a channelizing, effect so that water stays within the roadway. So you can imagine if we build a curb ramp, we are cutting that curb, which now means that flow is no longer channelized in the road. It has the potential of going up the ramp into the sidewalk. We are disrupting that channel for surface flow. And no matter what you do, there is no way your curb ramp is not going to have some kind of ponding from stormwater. It's meeting the low point of the street. It's just where the water is going to go. It's going to go to the gutter. The only way to reduce or, and potentially eliminate that is to intercept the surface water. You need stormwater infrastructure. Stormwater, will intercept it so that very little or a nuisance amount is at the bottom of the ramp. It's not enough to be a barrier to anybody anymore. You cannot just design a curb ramp to control ponding. Another major constraint, obviously, is right-of-way availability. Just how much room do we have? It needs to fit from the space between the property line and the curb. And there are ways to increase that space, with a curb bulb out, for example, but that also complicates drainage. You're basically kind of, in a sense, creating like a check dam. And you also have to consider are there on-street bicycle facilities? Because if that's the case, you may not be able to have that additional curb space. Class 1 bicycle facilities, they also have more right-of-way considerations. That's like the Albany Greenway, the Buchanan Bikeway. You just need a wider ramp for those kind of crossings. Now, there's also, especially here in Albany, a tricky one is private property encroachments in the right-of-way. Private property encroachments do limit our usability, and that can be either softscapes like landscaping, bushes, things like that, or hardscapes like retaining walls and staircases. And even though they are technically in the right-of-way, they are still private property, so removal is complicated. And for softscapes like landscaping, it is possible, but again, we're removing private property, so it does require us to, talk with risk management, talk with legal staff, and talk with the property owner. And you can imagine in a project, if we're doing six intersections, 4 curb ramps apiece, 4 corners apiece, that could potentially be a lot to work with. And realistically, you remove some landscaping, it may not actually buy a lot of room, but it could make a big difference. We don't really know until we're designing. Now, even given that hardscapes, they are not as feasible to move around. Retaining walls, staircases, this gets very expensive. It may not even be feasible in certain situations. And then there's also fences. Depending on their construction, they might consider them a softscape or a hardscape, but the more expensive and well-designed fences, the harder it's going to be to move around. Crosswalks constraints, not a huge constraint, but I do want to touch upon this one because it does have an effect here in Albany. And I'll get to that a little bit more detail later, but generally speaking, the requirement is that a curb ramp, and I'm talking about the ramp itself, not any flares, the curb ramp needs to be within the crosswalk width. It does not need to be centered within the crosswalk. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you place a ramp and you place a crosswalk and how that may affect other design elements. The only one that's a bit more complicated is the 444 crosswalk. And that is because the intention of the 444 crosswalk is to have that blank space aligned with the curb ramp. Otherwise, you're kind of getting into a continental one. It's not technically required, but you go for a 444 because you don't want that interaction with the paint or thermo or whatever material is used. So that does restrict the flexibility a bit on how you place everything and how it may affect other design elements. And then lastly, San Pablo is a Caltrans right-of-way. Caltrans has final review and approval on our curb ramps, so we have to stick to their standards. We can deviate from them, but they need to realistically be justifiable and necessary. And ultimately, even if we think they're justifiable and necessary, they can still say no because it's their right-of-way and they have ultimate approval. So I'm going to get into the requirements very briefly, and this is going to help just set up discussion for discretionary preferences, toolboxes, and then the methodology. But before I get into that, I just want to talk about what are the types of curb ramps. So we have our perpendicular curb ramp. This is where the my laser pointer's not showing? Oh, okay. Gotcha. This is where, if you're using a wheelchair, the landing is at the top. This is where you reorient yourself to the ramp, and you come down the ramp perpendicular to the curb. A parallel curb ramp is when you're coming down parallel to the curb, and then you turn at the bottom landing. The last one is a blended transition, and we use this interchangeably as a curb ramp, but technically blended transitions are not curb ramps. They have their own different requirements. They actually don't have as much flexibility with grades and slopes. They're defined as a wraparound connection at a corner, but I like the definition that it's a flush connection when there's no curb to cut through, because it basically, in terms of design, it's just almost an extension of a sidewalk. It doesn't have the higher grades that a curb ramp allows for. And to preface some of this conversation and discussion, I want to say that, when you're designing, you may think of these curb ramps as individuals, but realistically, the corner, you have to think of it as a corner. You have to think of the interaction between 2 ramps, because you can't, especially if it's a tighter right-of-way, you can't assume, you put one and then you go to the next one. You have to think of how these are interacting with each other and how they fit together. So requirements, there is a lot of requirements, and this is not intended to detail them all. And I'm going to try to strike out quickly through this, but also I have a visualization on the next page to kind of help a little bit. So curb ramps, they need to be installed at each pedestrian crossing. This is a PRO-AG requirement as well as a California Code of Regulations requirement. That means where you have 2 pedestrian crossings, there should be ramps that serve both, not one diagonal ramp at an apex corner. That should only be done if to the maximum extent feasible, you can't possibly fit 2 ramps to serve each of the 2 crossings. There's minimum widths. There's maximum grade change at the gutter. This is where the ramp goes down, and then it changes going up to into the crosswalk. There's a maximum grade change because if it's too extreme, your wheelchair can flip over. There's crosswalks widths. There's maximum grades, maximum cross slopes. That applies to both the ramps themselves and to the crosswalks. Curb ramps need perpendicular grade breaks. This is, kind of that perpendicular curb ramp I showed you earlier, where you're going straight down on the curb. It's because if you have a slanted grade break, you may have the wheels of the wheelchair not landing at the same time when you're going down, and it can also flip your wheelchair. This is actually a very commonly overlooked detail in construction and design. And once you kind of see it, you'll never unsee it when you look at curb ramps around the Bay Area.
Can you explain what grade breaks are?
Yes, so let me go back to this one. Grade breaks are essentially a change in grade. So you're coming down here, you're going down to the gutter, then you have a grade break at the curb gutter, and then you're going up. That when it's changing, between going up and down, that's considered a grade break. And this is what I mean when it needs to be perpendicular. Is a grade break needs to be perpendicular to the path. Similar to here, parallel ramps, it's not really a problem because they're always designed perpendicular because the level landing's at the bottom. But again, this is a very overlooked design element.
So you said you want it perpendicular, so that means if you're going straight down it, both wheels are at the same altitude always, right?
Exactly.
So there's cases where there's cases where that's not true, so the chair rocks.
It wobbles, and if it can lead to a lot of instability, and you can fall over.
We have some of those in Albany?
I don't doubt it. Again, this is partially because the PROAG requirements were always a kind of up in the air. They were not finalized till last year. And off the top of my head, I wouldn't have to check California Building Code if they always required it, but going forward, that is a requirement. That being said, the draft guidelines have been out since '99, so they have been there. They just have not been enforceable. Clear areas, this is just when you come down a perpendicular curb ramp, you're not just straight in the street. There's a shoulder or you're outside the bike lane, et cetera. So you can reorient yourself in the crosswalk without being in the midst of traffic. Landings, this is just what I was saying, where that turning space, that it's a level area that you can turn your wheelchair. And then pedestrian access route bypass, this is for blended transitions only. This is a level area that kind of swings the corner, so that you don't have to get into the downward grade of the blended transition. If you're in a wheelchair, you have a flat area you can move around the corner, or a level area, I should say. So visually, this is kind of what we're looking at. This shows kind of the stuff outside the immediate ramp. There's even more I could point out on the ramps, but I'm not going to do that. But this just shows, there's really not a lot of flexibility when we're designing curb ramps and blended transitions. We have a lot of prescriptive requirements that we have to meet when we're doing this.
Do you get a higher score if you make a mistake at a location with a higher number?
No, it just haunts you forever. When you walk by there, you're just like, darn it. So that was what I was saying, that needs to be a level area. So if let me bring out my pen. If you're coming around the corner here, but you don't want to cross the street in a wheelchair, you want to do this area is level. So it's easy to turn in.
Is it possible that it's impossible to satisfy all those constraints in a given crosswalk?
In a given crosswalk?
Yeah, this is feasible. Satisfying all those constraints is feasible.
Oh, you have to satisfy all this. And it's often done, but this is what makes it very complicated and why there's very little wiggle room when we're designing these. and why there often has to be a lot of iterations before we can kind of say, okay, this is what actually works and meets accessibility requirements. Okay, so I'm going to go to discretionary preferences and design toolbox. And, discretionary preferences, this is kind of where we're looking probably for the most comment. It's something we can wait till the end to discuss, but, feel free to stop me during this if you want to talk a little bit more about preferences, or if in particular there's something we missed, because this is, to our knowledge, this is the capture of everything that we've kind of seen during discrete projects in kind of one place. So what are these? And as I said, these are previous recommendations by the Transportation Commission regarding curb ramp design and construction. These are coming at different projects, and we try to remember them all in our heads, and now this is a document to write them down in. So these are specifically things that are not required by ADA, ProAg, or the building code. These are optional features and preferences desired by the community, and we incorporate them to the best of our ability during design and then during construction. The first is alignment with the pedestrian circulation path. We want people, it's been communicated to us that we want to design curb ramps that are as straight as possible to the sidewalk path, so that you're not making any turning motions when you get to the corner. You kind of just walk down the curb ramp. Now, I do want to point out, all of these three configurations are compliant. They meet accessibility requirements. We're just looking to design as close to possible as that configuration on the right, where it's just a straight line. Edge treatment, when we're placing retaining curbs, we want to make sure that they're not within the pedestrian circulation path. That way there's not any tripping hazards, and in particular that the corners of these retaining curbs are rounded. Now, I want to specify, it's been communicated that we want these rounded corners. But we are pointing out interior only because we want to keep Public Works' desires to keep the retaining curb at the gutter a straight line, and I'll talk about that when we get to our toolbox. But otherwise, these corners are rounded. Corner features, it's been communicated that we want to avoid kind of intersecting flares. So you can see on the top left, we have some space between the two flares. And then on the right, it's where the flares meet each other, and there's kind of that quick high point that can potentially be a tripping hazard. It's been directed, that we want that one on the left. Typically, I think we design for 2 feet with some legal room to go down to 1 foot. But there are obvious advantages of, going against the preference on the one on the right, because they generally they fit in more constrained situations. You can see how much closer those ramps can fit and how far the other two are away from each other, to make sure that we're meeting requirements and that preference. It's also been communicated to us that we want to avoid the installation of wedges. That's kind of that raised retaining sidewalk curb at the apex of the corner. These are a potential tripping hazard, especially if there isn't something vertical to delineate it, like a signpost on the one on the left. But they do have a lot of advantages. The one on the right's a good example. This is a very common use in San Francisco, is to put the storm drains at the corner. And when we have a wedge, it allows us to have some more extreme grades at the corner because it's not part of the path of travel. So we can better capture that stormwater and kind of reduce the amount of ponding potential if during a heavy storm. It also just allows us to squeeze those ramps tighter together. We can't do that without using a wedge or kind of that intersected flare. Another one is 444 is the Albany preferred high visibility treatment for crosswalks. And again, that's to align that blank space with the ramp and the pedestrian circulation path. So these are a couple configurations on the bottom around Albany that are using perpendicular curb ramps and other parallel and blended transitions. There is less flexibility on the crosswalk placement, as I mentioned. We can't move that crosswalk around. So there is, if parking is a concern ever, because of, I don't remember the exact, but there's the Assembly bill where basically it's on approach, 20 foot of red curb is prohibited to the edge of crosswalk. And in areas where, you might have a driveway near the crosswalk, we don't have a lot of flexibility, just kind of nudge it a few feet to try and get that parking space. It's pretty much going to go away because we can't, again, these crosswalks do not have flexibility to move on most ramp types. So what if discretionary preferences don't work? So when we do deviate these, our process will be to review it with the commission for their feedback. I'm thinking typical situations of Albany, I can see this happening, is in Albany Hill. There's just a lot of things we need to think about when we're designing, and it's very likely we're going to have to make some adjustments and compromises. Other situations that I think of are the southeast part of town, like around the Albany Terrace area. Those are just really tight sidewalks and very little room to work with, narrow streets, so not any flexibility to adjust curb lines probably. And then lastly, anywhere we have Class 1 bikeways and facilities like the Buchanan Bikeway and the Albany Greenway, we're considering more than just pedestrians at that point, so there's a lot of extra review that needs to go in there because we're also talking about bicyclists and other users using these curb ramps. So that's kind of the capture of discretionary preferences. I'm going to move on unless there's any questions about or any comments on discretionary preferences that we may not have captured here.
I just have a quick question. Are you going to discuss roundabouts at all in this conversation? They're kind of like curb ramps that go on in a big circle.
You mean like the wraparounds at corners?
Well, there's lots of roundabouts, but we have like Calusa Circle. I just wonder if there's any difference in designation or concerns from an engineering perspective about how you build them. I say this because I had a good friend who was riding bikes with me, a very experienced cyclist, and he was going about 10 miles an hour and somehow managed to hit something on a brand new circle. And it had some of those funny lips like we just mentioned. And he flipped his wheel around hard enough that it broke the head of his femur and broke his wrist. You think that, there's an old saying, when you crash going fast, you skid. When you crash going slow, you bounce. So these low-speed accidents snags your wheel can be really dangerous. So I'm wondering, going forward, I don't mean to get ahead of you, but going forward, if there's some discussion of that.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
We don't have any roundabouts per se projected in Albany.
What about the traffic circle?
We have mini roundabouts, which, as I understand it, leave the sidewalk and curb cuts in the same locations.
Yes, so mini traffic circles, we call them. They work within the constraints of the existing street. And then there's engineered roundabouts, which are much more complicated, actually have their own unique public right-of-way accessibility guidelines requirements. And when we talk about roundabouts, you're actually typically moving the crossings further from the corners to properly engineer them. So
I'm suggesting, since we don't have any projected, we should table this until such
No,
time
I
as
agree.
we do.
I was confused about the distinction between a roundabout and a mini roundabout, because we are considering them for the Canes Bikeway. But I'm happy to move on.
San Jose.
Santa Fe?
Or Santa Fe, not San Jose.
Yeah, so it's good you brought it up, so we could clear that up.
And I do want to point out, if it's like a quick build, that actually won't affect curb ramp. Curb ramps don't need to be brought up because it's not considered an alteration. So typically, if you're doing like a full-on pave where then you're putting a more permanent traffic circle, that is a good time to talk about it because then your curb ramps will be upgraded.
I have a question about the history of the discretionary preferences. Is there a document that states what we've settled on in the past, the discretionary preferences, or is it kind of word of mouth like the way you described it to us?
It comes up during a project review. Mark, I don't know if there's more you want to say, but this document is intended to capture those, and it's going to be a living document.
Right, I'm just wondering if there already is a document or if this is the first time we're creating a document.
This is really Mark Hurley, Public Works Director. This is really the first time that we've tried to put this down in one place. I know there's had discussions back when I started here almost 8 years ago, and it seems like one of the struggles we have is every time we have staff turnover, we use different consultants, we're starting from square one. So the idea is that this is really a collection of all those local preferences that is a living document. We can change it as we need it, but then we can hand that to new employees, consultant groups, and probably more importantly now, developer groups, because that's what that shows how we want the design process to go through and how we integrate these things.
I was mostly questioning whether there's like a reference that we can look at as a basis for what we're going to produce tonight, but it sounds like maybe there's not.
So there was the curb line document was part of the staff memo, and it had a section on discretionary preferences. That's the first and only so far that we have it captured in a single place.
Okay, I'll look at that, thanks.
Actually, that's really helpful. Can you explain to us, like, in a normal process, how a curb ramp is built or modified? In that process, how this document will play?
Yep. So James is probably going to get into that a little more, right?
Yeah. So we're
Yeah, it's definitely not. There are a lot of details to it, and
Yes.
I really appreciate that. But it's just like that's not for everyone to read how to design. So I want to know who is going to be the audience and who are supposed to
So-
be educated on this.
Sure. So this is going to be design teams, essentially. Design consultants, our own staff, project teams that are working for a developer and so forth. So it's not, it's a guideline that anyone can read and look at, but it's going to be most useful for development teams,
Okay.
engineers.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
So moving on, those are the discretionary preferences we have captured in the document. I do want to very informally talk about, we've also added a design toolbox in that document, and these are just features on our curb ramp designs to kind of improve safety and aesthetics and have a consistent approach when we're doing it. They're not absolute, and they definitely can be modified when necessary. I say that with one exception right here, is detectable warning surfaces. If you've traveled around the country, most of the time they're red. California is unique because California Building Code requires them to be yellow. It is an absolute requirement. We are not allowed to change these colors if it's for a curb ramp. That being said, that is the only requirement in here. The rest of these are not absolute. So we typically design these, we want a 5-foot width minimum when we start design. 4 foot is the minimum requirement, but we like to start with 5 feet. And we align the domes of the detectable warning surfaces with the expected path of travel. It's a little hard to visualize because it's a bit blurry, but the arrows are kind of showing your typical direction you're walking, and then that grid shows how we kind of align the domes so it's matching up with the expected path of travel. So back to that retaining curb that I was talking about earlier, we want to keep those retaining curbs straight at the gutter because it reinforces directionality for people using cane detection. So if they're using that cane, they know if it's rounded, they might start sending them the wrong way, but if it's straight, it's showing them the proper direction of the crosswalk. And that does give us some flexibility. If we have angled crosswalks, maybe it would be appropriate to angle the retaining curbs there, but typically we're looking at a right angle at the gutter. When we're doing these retaining curbs too, like this bottom left image, for people who aren't paying attention, it is a potential drop-off risk. You might roll your ankle, hurt yourself because you walk off a 6-inch gap, essentially. So what we want to do is we want to put some kind of visible and detectable difference. That way, even if you're not paying attention, you can kind of feel that, hey, I'm not maybe I should reorient myself. We do that either through landscaping or through something like a decorative concrete. The decorative concrete on the right is an example on San Pablo that we just installed. Closing street crossing. So when a pedestrian crossing at a corner is prohibited or not intended, we are required to put a cane detectable feature there. That is typically, most cities, most municipalities, they put in that kind of barrier or railing that you see that picture on the top right. We feel that it results in an unpleasant aesthetic, kind of gives a carceral feel. It's not nice to look at. It gets hit, we have to immediately go out and put on a whole new one. It can get graffitied. It's our last option. We don't want to do that. So where feasible, we'd rather put in a planting strip or a landscaping. But if it's going to be too narrow for landscaping where it won't be very effective, or if it's a place where on a hill where it'll just wash out, or if it is a high trash generation area, we'll go to the raised curb. So this is these bottom two images are an example at San Pablo and Portland. Before you could theoretically just walk straight into the street, but now this raised curb that we just installed is intended to reinforce directionality that this is not a place to cross. And the kind of last toolbox kit piece I'm going to talk about today is storm drain inlet locations. So we want to design so, when you're walking around, even if you're not using the exact ramp itself, when you do walk off that curb, you're not stepping into a storm drain. It could be an issue depending on the storm drain inlet, may not be an issue, but we just don't want you walking over it. So if it's what we're looking at are those top two images where that storm drain is kind of completely out of where you're expected to be walking, out of the crosswalk and out of that back of sidewalk line. Now, sometimes it may not, it depends on the project scope, cost, all sorts of things. It may not be feasible to move an inlet. So we want to try and kind of alter that path direction, either with a planting strip, preferably, but also a retaining curb. So those are those two middle images. The bottom two are what we kind of want to avoid, where, if you're walking and not paying attention, you could step right on the storm drain. But I do want to stress those bottom two configurations are compliant in terms of accessibility requirements. It's just what we want to avoid. We want to design the top two, not the bottom two. So I've thrown a lot of information out there, a lot about requirements, a lot about discretionary preferences, a lot of things, curb ramps. So the curb ramp design is difficult. We have to look at site constraints. We have to look at accessibility requirements. We have to just think about safety in general, things that might not neatly fit in those two boxes. And then we have the discretionary preferences that we also need to try and include in that. So there's a lot going on. And as I said earlier, curb ramps, they shouldn't be designed as individuals. You really need to think them how they're working in conjunction at a corner. And in Albany, outside of a few select streets, we have very narrow right-of-ways. So that means our curb ramps are going to be very tightly paired, or they're going to end up merged. So ultimately, the intention, at the end of this document is to help streamline, our project delivery and design by, outlining a methodology for choosing curb ramp types at a typical corner, which I'll get to in a second. So what we did was we simulated different corners with different curb ramp setups, sidewalk ramps, and blend-in transitions. I did not talk about sidewalk ramps today because they are not curb ramps. They're even more complicated in some regards, but essentially it's when you're going at a steeper slope along the sidewalk. So curb ramps generally you're allowed a maximum 5% grade. Curb ramps allow you to go up to 8.3%. Sidewalk ramps also let you go up to 8.3%, but they require a lot. You need landings up top and bottom. You need retaining curbs. You need a lot of things. But they're important to look at because of blended transitions, for example, they don't have that kind of grade flexibility. But if you do combine them with the sidewalk ramp and it's properly designed, it can give you a good elevation change to make sure that you can get to the low point of the street when you combine them. And this simulation is qualitative. Every design site is unique. A ramp that might need X feet at one location may need X plus 5 at another. So this is to qualitatively compare them to each other at a typical corner. And what am I saying at a typical corner? I'm saying a typical four-way intersection with normal pedestrian-only sidewalks with relatively flat topography. When we have intersections at T intersections, mid-block crossings, or Santa Fe intersections where they're more complex, this methodology may not apply. When I'm talking about typical sidewalks, I'm talking about people, pedestrians, they're the ones using it. When bikes come in the mix, this methodology might not apply. And this methodology particularly is, I can tell you right out, is probably not going to apply to the hills because, again, those are very complicated designs. So with that in mind, this is kind of a breakdown of different simulations at a corner. I'm going to simplify this in a minute, so bear with me. The left column, we did use the Caltrans has a naming convention that pretty much everyone uses, and I'm going to visualize what these look like shortly. But this is, just so you're wondering, what is A, B, C, D, G, F, R, X? So the columns here, user comfort, ease of use. This is how easy is it to navigate a corner? Typically if you're using a wheelchair, is it very tight? Is your turning space constrained? Are you making very hard turns just to get around the corner? The second is hazard tripping risk. This, I think, is fairly straightforward. Are you placing things in the path that may be a safety risk, like a wedge? The third is ponding potential, and I want to be clear, this is where there's no stormwater infrastructure present. You can kind of ignore this column if there's a storm drain inlet, which, as you may or may not have seen with a lot of project reviews, we don't have a lot of storm drains at our corners. So, and like I said earlier, curb ramp design alone will not control drainage, but depending on your design, it may, it may change the amount of water you're seeing. You might see a ton of water versus an annoying amount of water. One that still may be an issue for a wheelchair, but is easily passable by other folks. And the last one is just generally the amount of space you need. What's the expected width to fit that curb ramp. So we eliminated some of these configurations that had relatively the same amount of public, of space, but had more drawbacks. So we got down to these 7 configurations, 4 that we, might be appropriate for where we have a lot of space, and then 3 where we're more constrained. And these are what these 7 look like. I'm going to try and kind of go through this a bit quickly, but feel free to stop me. But before I do that, I do want to kind of explain some of the details here. So this kind of hatched marking, this is basically where it needs to be level. It's a very flat area. That's because this is your turning space for a wheelchair. Anywhere you're seeing this letter A with this kind of greenish brown, that's where we might install a planting strip or a decorative stamped concrete. These dark grays are retaining curbs here. And these dark grays at the apex of the corner are those wedges that we were talking about earlier. And these corners will be rounded in design. For my sanity when drawing these, I made them straight lines, but they would be rounded realistically. So I'll start with the top 4, which are kind of the high public right-of-way. I'm going to try something because I want to play around with these a little bit, and hopefully I don't break this presentation. This one will be a little interactive, so I can explain some things visually to the best of my ability. So these are kind of where we have a lot of space. And you can see when we're doing those, these 2 case A's with that little flare separation, they take up a lot of space. You can kind of relatively see, you're already seeing a decent amount more space compared to if we were to do an apex wedge. That being said, if we didn't do that separation, there is some flexibility, and I'm going to try and show that. So you can actually get a similar amount of space that the wedge does, but it does require you to kind of have that intersecting flare. So you can move these ramps closer to the corner. And that gets you, a similar, it can use less space, similar to how Apex Wedge, but it does mean that we are now at that where we have this intersecting flare, which is generally a discretionary preference from community that we want to avoid installing. But I just want to highlight that you can fit these into tighter spaces if you do that. Similarly, the wedge has the same idea where you can fit it into a tighter space if you were to kind of reduce the wedge size, assuming your grades on your ramp worked. Actually, let me use this one. If you had a smaller wedge, you could potentially move this landing tighter to the corner, which means you wouldn't need as much space for these ramps to work.
Does that change the slope of the ramp?
It can, and this is only in situations where you have the flexibility. And generally on flatter topography, you might have this flexibility, but we typically try to avoid installing wedges because of that, tripping hazard. But you can see, relative to that 2 case A on the left, how much less right-of-way this is using. So on a flat street, this could be very easily put into a bit more of a tighter right-of-way. Just fix that. Any questions before I move on to more constrained widths?
Seems like the first one and the second one, or the third one, are better for wheelchair, maybe? Because think about it, if they're not using the ramp, but they just simply want to make a turn. Seems like 2 case A and 2 case G offers more of a space for it to turn smoothly. I never sit on a wheelchair before, but that's what I was thinking. If you're driving the second one and the fourth one, it seems like it's a 90-degree turn. But for the first one, the third one, you can, you dip down and go. I don't know.
Yep, these perpendicular separated ramps, these are generally the most comfortable we can get. But they'll have slight, drawbacks potentially when you're comparing. But these are generally anywhere where you have 2 separated perpendicular curb ramps like this, it's the most comfortable kind of configuration you're going to get for users. But again, it also requires the most amount of space. So let me open this back up. Okay. I got rid of my notes. That's right. So when we're working with tighter right-of-ways, thank you. We have blended transitions and then these 2 TXCs, which we actually call them, I think our standard calls that middle one a modified C, and then a merged case G. So I'll talk with the blended transition first because that's kind of an in-between where it does require a little bit more space than the 2 on the right, but it does require less space than the ones we were just talking about. And this is what I was talking about where you're combining a sidewalk ramp and a blended transition. I'm not going to get too much into the technical details, but that's why internally we call it a type 2. That's not a designation you're going to find anywhere else. We just call it that. So, generally speaking, that is what can fit in kind of like where we have a little bit more wiggle room. And it is, it's a little constrained with the turning space, but it's pretty comfortable compared to the ones on the right. The one on the far right. So the 2KC and the merge case G, these are where we just do not have a lot of room. We are working with very tight spaces. And I'm sorry that this table and these 2 should be red to kind of signify that. But it requires Oh, no, it's green. Sorry. Never mind. So we have our 2K C. This is our modified C. These ones are pretty comfortable because you can, they come down, it's a flush connection, and you can kind of smoothly turn. Versus a case G where you're coming down here, you have a very tight, constricted moving place. You need to make a hard 90 degree to get back around the corner. Now, 2KC is not saying it's level here, but effectively when we're designing at the low point at the gutter here and here, the whole thing will be level. If you've seen these on Washington, west of Masonic, east of Cornell, they're pretty flat. The whole thing's flat. Now, the one on the right can pretty much fit anywhere. It's major drawback that it's just generally not a very comfortable ramp for people with disabilities. It does have it does minimize the amount of ponding that you would see versus a modified C, that 2KC in the middle. But it is not a standard ramp. It is the only ramp that is not a Caltrans standard. So it would not be applicable to San Pablo. We actually pulled that design from San Francisco's standard details. And I've actually seen these built, that merge case G built in Oakland as well. There's one in my neighborhood that works in a very, very tight corner. But generally, this is not a standard and not a common ramp. But it's one that might work well with Albany when we don't have any other options. Now, that all being said, this is the methodology we've gotten to try and help us streamline and have a uniform approach when we're working. It was a lot of steps to get here, but they were very important.
This is the simple version, right?
Yes, this is as simple as it's going to get.
Can I just say that the visuals in this presentation are spectacular?
Thank you. Curb ramps are very hard to visualize in text, so pictures are incredibly important.
All the diagrams and pictures are just incredibly informative. Really appreciate them.
So, ideally we do those two separate case A's. That is like the gold standard of a curb ramp corner. But it needs a lot of space. And, sometimes the flares may need to be modified because there's obstructions, such as utilities, just very strange grades that we want to make sure people aren't walking through, so we make it into a planter strip. Maybe even in the future, it's a GI location. Regardless, if we need to modify the flares, we kind of follow this path where it's modified. Some elements are modified to make it a case F or a case G. That means there's a retaining curb on one side at minimum. However, if we're doing a bunch of modifications where it ends up having that tripping hazard, it's been communicated to us we don't want any wedges or tight flares, so it's on typical sidewalks, we'll go to a blended transition type 2 instead to eliminate those potential risks. Or if there's just not enough room, we go to blended transition type 2. I did not talk about this modified case A with ramp downs because it's complicated, but essentially, just really quickly, it's two case A's, but we do ramps down to a landing that then ramp down the curb ramp. It's a very rare situation, but it's in our toolbox in case we need it. It's essentially, we're ramping down these kind of here, like this blended transition, but then it leads you to this point on the 2 case A. It needs a lot of room, so it's a very rare situation, but it could help when we have a little bit more difficult elevation we're working with. Now, going from the blended transition type 2, again, if it's still, we just don't have enough room to get that to fit, we ask ourselves, is there going to be a stormwater system put in place at that corner? If the answer is no, we'll probably go forward with the merged case G configuration. But if there is going to be stormwater infrastructure, we would do the modified C or the 2 case C, however we want to call it, because it is a bit more comfortable to navigate. So this kind of sums up everything we were talking about with how we want to have a uniform approach at a typical corner is we use this methodology and throw in our toolbox for the more aesthetic and safety elements. And then just very quickly, as I mentioned, this is a living document. The City of Albany, we're looking to update some standards next year, time willing. And, that might incorporate some things like make sure you put the rounded corners in the interior. Things like that might get captured in our standard details. Or if there's anything, that our details affect the curb ramp guidelines, I don't think so, but that, we would update it. Active transportation plan, that is in the works, and it may end up being a vehicle for the community to have preferences on curb ramps. I don't really know, but it is a plan that deals with how pedestrians move around. So if there is something like that that comes up, we would update the curb ramp guidelines. Watershed management plan, not really probably going to affect curb ramp guidelines per se, but it is going to help us put together a blueprint for future stormwater improvements, which may help guide how we do end up choosing the curb ramp at a corner. Because if we know where we're installing stormwater, we know, okay, we want this merged case. We don't want the merged case G, we want the type C, the 2-case C. PROAG, as I mentioned, this is technically not enforceable still. The 2 federal agencies that require it to be adopted before it's enforceable is the Federal Department of Transportation and the DOJ. The Federal Department of Transportation is closing their comments period this month, so there is a good likelihood they will be adopting it soon. The DOJ has not indicated when they are, but I'm going to be hoping it's by next year so that this is finally closed and they become enforceable guidelines. Regardless, since they are a final rule on them, it's in the engineering world, it's a very bad luck to not be following them at this point. And most folks are now using these as de facto guidelines. Caltrans standards, they update their standards pretty regularly. Probably won't affect our guidelines, but if they ever do end up adding unique configurations, that might be something worth updating our document with, like maybe merge case G becomes something they like. I also suspect that when PROAG becomes enforceable, they may have some final tweaks, and if that affects anything, we'd update our guidelines document. And then lastly, the California Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Design. This kind of tells us how our signs are supposed to look like. So not a huge effect, but some accessibility signage is basically regulated through this document. So if anytime we need to put that, say like on our pedestrian barriers, there's specific signage. This document, if it ever changes that, might affect, very minor tweaks to our guidelines. And with that, I will open it up to final questions and comments.
Do you ever interact with the Center for the Blind? Ask them about safety issues for them? Seems like we have some beta testers out there in Albany, intentionally.
We generally have not recently. They've actually communicated to us they like it when it's not compliant because it's a better training ground for them.
I've heard that.
But at the end,
Putting automated vehicles in San Francisco, hardest possible situation.
yeah.
Well, okay. Then I was pondering this. The only significant technological change I think that would affect curb design in the future is the intersection of quiet electric vehicles and people who stare at their cell phones and don't see where they're going. Around campus, I've seen some very humorous incidents, but so I'm wondering if that's a criteria in designing curbs or thinking about curbs going forward. It's somebody staring at their cell phone and walking at the same time is essentially blind.
Well, the detectable warning surfaces are kind of the best way to communicate that. They have to be 3 feet. That is a very prescriptive requirement by the California Building Code. So that's a surface to kind of indicate to our best ability of saying you are now walking on the street. Because most of the safety elements we talk about, it's for those distracted pedestrians. People with cane detection and wheelchairs are very apt at moving around the right-of-way pretty safely. It's distracted pedestrians that aren't. And those are kind of where these safety elements like the planning strip and retaining curbs come into play.
My last question is, when you walk around Albany, do you immediately classify all these different curbs as you go?
I was just in Denver, and all I could do is look at curb ramps when I was crossing streets.
Well, I was wondering, because if this is a lot to digest, but if you had sort of a, greatest hit of curbs in Albany, then you could give us a little map and number them, and I would go look at them and go, oh, not that I'm asking you to put a lot of time into something like that, but I'm just curious if maybe such a map already exists.
No, I will say I like the stamped concrete we just put in on San Pablo. That's a new, that was really the first time we put raised curbs in. It was a bit of a last minute change because the design had been languishing so long that it wasn't even, there were no pedestrian barriers even put in. So internally it was, Public Works was like, how do we throw in a feature that is not a barrier so it doesn't look like we have a bunch of barriers all up and down San Pablo?
San Pablo and where?
Portland, San Pablo, Portland's a good corner. That shows that. That's generally a pretty good corner because it shows some fun things like sidewalk ramps, retaining curbs with banisters, although I don't think the banister's been installed just yet. Stamped concrete.
Yeah, that's right, before Dana Meyer.
I don't think we can hear you.
So that's just before Dana. I do Blue Glove Crew, and I know Ken has done it in the past, so I walk those streets once a week. So I will now have something to amuse me instead of picking up trash.
And Lower Solano also is kind of our best, that and Lower Marin are kind of the best ramps that we have around too, just because we have the right of way for it.
I'm done, thanks.
Just to add on that, most of the pictures that were included in the written version of your report has identified where they are mostly throughout the report. So if
Okay.
you see one you like, you can figure out where to go.
Every ramp picture is in Albany except one which is explicitly calls out San Francisco.
As a not so good example, I don't know if you happen to have this one at the top of your mind, but Curtis and Sonoma northeast corner, I walk there almost every day, and I almost never walk in the curb ramp. And I'm wondering if you can explain why that is, like what's wrong with it. Curtis and Sonoma
Curtis and
northeast corner.
Sonoma.
If I'm walking south along Curtis from Marin, and I want to descend into Sonoma, I just walk on the dirt, essentially.
Curtis. I'm just pulling it up. Give me 1 second.
And I was wondering if that was so bad that you would know it by name as what's wrong with it. But
So
it's just my personal pick.
I'm curious, which corner was it?
Northeast corner.
Yeah.
It's a place where I think there was supposed to be a raised crosswalk going east-west, but it
Yes.
didn't work out. And then it's the north-south crossing that I struggle with there, though.
This is kind of why these guidelines exist, because that's actually not even a curb ramp. That's a blended transition and a curb ramp. And it looks like because I don't know why they designed it like this. It's definitely an interesting layout. It does meet ADA compliance, but it's not how we would have designed it if they followed our methodology.
Okay, that's good to know.
But again, it is ADA compliant to the best of my, without measuring the grades.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what always gets me is that the direction you have to walk, the ramp there is very narrow, and as a pedestrian, you have to turn. Even if you're going straight, you have to kind of wiggle around in an S-shape path to follow it.
You can see the desired path, deadness of the grass.
Yeah, that's my footprint.
Having been involved with this particular project, I would say that the majority of the attention on the project was elsewhere in the project. There were a lot of other things going on that took up design attention, like the raised crosswalk and the sidewalk adjacent to the elementary school.
And
It's not an excuse, it's just an explanation.
And again, without measuring the grades itself, it does look technically compliant.
Okay, but what I'm glad to hear is that the principles you already have in place in this document would already prevent something like that from happening again.
Yes.
We don't need to.
This is also a maintenance nightmare. So we would not design this kind of thing either in the future.
So I have another.
Keep
Okay.
going.
I have another question on a different topic, which is when you look at the discretionary preferences, it seems like you've tried to capture what the commission has asked for in the past, and you've made it clear that that is like the second priority. The first priority is to comply with all the unbreakable requirements. But is there anything in the discretionary wish list that rubs you the wrong way as an engineer that you would like to recommend we reconsider?
Well, first, I wouldn't say it's a 1-2 approach. We start with a conceptual, which captures the preferences first, realistically. Is like, because if we can get how we want it aligned and everything, then we can start designing. If we can see those preferences and say, you know, that's just not going to work, then we start going into the requirements and clawing back at preferences. So it is an approach that we're kind of looking at both at the same time. I wouldn't.
But do you ever run into a situation where you can imagine what seems to you to be a better way to do it, but it goes against the preferences that we've articulated in the commission, and you end up doing it the second best way to meet our preferences when maybe our preferences were a little bit uninformed? And if we knew better what you're up against there, we might have expressed the preferences differently and better.
So I kind of tried to point a little bit to that with, you know, those intersecting flares and wedges. They allow us to fit ramps in a lot tighter spaces. And then you get the 2 separate directional ramps. And it may be able to better align with the pedestrian path because we're tightly pairing them. But, you know, there's trade-offs, there's that slipping risk. So we would go that way if we feel strongly in the more unique situations. Otherwise, we're going to kind of skip going with some of the preferences, some of the more comfortable ramps to the more uncomfortable ramps to make sure that we can meet preferences.
Okay, so it sounds like you're not really encouraging us to rethink or restate or change the preferences because you can bend them and work around them as needed when it really matters.
Yeah, and then when I was saying earlier, when discretionary preferences don't work, we would come back. So, and those are the situations like we really strongly believe an intersecting flare is a better option here than going to maybe a blended transition, which would meet those preferences. But for these technical reasons and other constraints, we think we should go with this.
So you would come to us and ask for a deviation from the preferences, not just when it's impossible to comply with the preferences, but also when you think that you could do better by deviating from the preferences, that we could get a better outcome.
It would be brought up during typical project review, basically. When we come with our design plans, we would now kind of upfront say, we went through the methodology, chose them because of this. But in those kind of situations, we say, we want to tweak it because of, and go with this instead.
Okay, I just want to make sure that the preferences aren't getting in the way of you promoting to us what you think is the best option.
Well, it gets complicated because the wedges, for example, and the intersecting flares, it's a bit of a preference. It's not technically, there's a little bit of liability, but one might argue keeping the separation is important, and one might argue saying, I don't really care, I want the intersecting flares. We're trying to follow what was the preference given us, from the commission, but anybody can argue one way or the other which they think is more comfortable and why. So we're kind of just taking the commission's preferences as the community's feedback to make, go that direction, because you can kind of sit here all day and say, I like wedges, I don't like wedges. I like flares when they intersect, I don't like flares when they intersect. But only when they're, so only when we think for a technical reason that we're going to, an intersecting flare or wedge might work, that is when we'll bring it up explicitly in design.
So yeah, it's really gratifying to know that the comments of the commission have been heard over the years and to have it formulated into something that is so very detailed. It's great. I just have one question. You referred to enforcement several times. What's the mechanism for enforcement? Is it the courts? Is it grant funding? What do you mean when you say enforceable?
They become like any other kind of like building code requirement. It's similar to that. You have to build it like this. And so theoretically, if somebody, caught that it wasn't, you can file an ADA complaint, and I'm sure at some point that would make its way up and require reconstruction. How that mechanism works, that's a good question. But as engineers, now that we have a very strict guideline, we're going to follow it.
Wouldn't suggest otherwise. Well, okay, maybe that's too strong a statement. I wouldn't expect anything less. How about that?
Just want to say thank you. This is a really nice education session for me. I never, thought there are so many details going to the ramps, and you explained it really well. Probably this will be not sure if it's the same question for this, but in August, we received a resident's email. I think everyone here received it. This person was a homeowner in Albany, and he or she were trying to repair the sidewalks in front of her house, which is a nice way of doing it. But there are some requirements she heard that she needs to comply, and then that was a small enough job, nobody's gonna willing to take it. So I was looking at this. I mean, you guys are so capable. Can you come up with I want to add to work to you, but can you come up with a widely acceptable guideline for homeowners to repair their sidewalk to make their life easier and also make overall sidewalk condition better? Everyone in Albany can follow. And I hope there ain't that many details as ramps. I hope it will be easy just to make it flat, don't trip on it or something like that, or materialize, you should avoid certain slippery tiles or something. Is that a possibility?
So California Building Code and ABA already have that kind of things, like 4-foot minimum, 5% grade max. These are things that, on like a sidewalk path, they're already out there as that's just a standard requirement that really any competent contractor should know when they're doing sidewalk work.
What I'm saying is it possible to have like a Albany residence handbook, to have all the information there, but simplified, just like what you did here. You simplified all the complicated questions, so people maybe like me, I can see it. Okay, if I want to repair the sidewalk in front of my house, I can go to Home Depot and know how to do it easily. That's with the assumption that the sidewalk it will be easier than a ramp. I'm not trying to do a ramp myself.
To be honest, I think our sidewalk standards actually have everything that you would need in terms of maximum slopes and minimum widths. So I'm not actually sure what the issue is, because sidewalk's actually one of the easiest things to build, because there's kind of three things you need to do: minimum width, maximum cross slope, maximum grade.
We need a licensed contractor to do it. That's
Yes.
the obstacle.
And this is why we have a licensed contractor do it.
Yeah, I think we would discourage a homeowner to repair the sidewalk in front of their house by themselves. They would want a licensed contractor come and get an encroachment permit or a permit for us. Those are no charge permits, I believe.
Sidewalk repairs are no charge.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And so we try to make it easy on that perspective, but we do want a licensed contractor just because it is so important, and the details are there on our website.
Appreciate it.
Can we bring back a requirement for the cute stamps about who did it?
Interesting, you're the second person to ask me that. James has been collecting some of the old ones as we run across them, so we're trying to preserve those.
Oh, okay.
But I think that has gone out of style. I don't know why.
Fortunate.
I did have a contractor ask about it. And he said, could I stamp it? And I said, sure. But I don't know.
Doesn't the stamp change the grade?
This is probably a good reason is if it is a very wide stamp, you are getting into that issue of a 1/4 inch caster can get stuck in it. So it could be a reason as to why they don't, but I doubt that the stamp itself is enough of an issue. I just don't think people do it anymore.
Yeah, I don't.
I believe if you're paying for the sidewalk repair, you have the right to personalize a corner.
You can scratch your name in it.
Yes, I will say that
We'll
we
buff it
do.
out.
We get plenty of stamps, just not contractor stamps when we pour back sidewalks. I've seen a lot of initials in writing, and especially when we were doing the southwest side time, turkey feet are a part of some of the sidewalks down on Dartmouth Street.
Excellent.
So back to the email we got from the constituent or our resident. It was my impression that the sticking point was finding a contractor.
Yes, yes.
And there are certain things that are outside of the control of the city. The supply of contractors is one of them.
Are there any further questions? Do we have anybody holding up their hand online?
If you'd like to make a public comment on this item, please use the raise your hand feature for those participating online. Not seeing any hands raised.
Right.
So
I was just going to, before I called for discussion, I wanted to echo my fellow commissioners' praise for the clarity and educational quality of the presentation. Thank you. Do we have any further discussion?
So I think it's all very clear and straightforward, and your progression of applying them is great. And you mentioned the right angles at the curb on the street. And that seems fine to me. I may have objected to that in the past, but if all of the internal sidewalk angles are curved, and you use that one right angle to help focus people on the path, that seems reasonable. It also helps delineate the difference between being on the sidewalk and the awareness you need to have when you're on the street. So that seems good too. Wedges seem like a great feature when there's a storm drain or other obstacle. The wedge you showed had a pointed internal angle, but I know it's just a representative, not an exact plan. I'm not totally against wedges. I just think they can be surprises.
Does anybody else have anything to say or any other additional comments? All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, go ahead.
It seems like this is our big chance to update the design, the discretionary preferences. This is like a once every few years reckoning about whether these preferences still align with what we want or not, and I'm not hearing any desire to change them, and that's fine if we really don't want to change them. I just want to make sure we're taking the opportunity if we do. I don't have any changes to suggest.
Yeah, I don't feel like I have anything that I would change.
So can the comments that you just made, do those amount to any change, any suggested changes to the document or the way it's written?
I really don't think so.
Okay.
I want to just point out, it wasn't talked about because I didn't go over every single element of the toolbox, but we do say if wedges are installed, that we should be considering some appropriate vertical delineation. So it doesn't just pop up out of nowhere.
I read that in your document. Yeah. Vertical or maybe a surface treatment, depending on the situation. Well, I guess I need to ask, this idea of rounded corners internal to the pedestrian area versus right angles external to the pedestrian area, is that in the specification or the preferences, or is that shading?
So discretionary preferences are explicit with the rounded interior corners, and then our toolbox is to keep them straight at the corner, at the gutter.
I think this is really strong going forward. I don't have any other suggestions.
Right. Well, if we don't have any further suggestions, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, if everybody is ready to proceed, let's go on to item 5.2.
Okay. Item 5.2 is the Pierce Cleveland Bikeway Connection Project grant application. I don't know if I should be introducing myself right now, but I'm Ben Matlaw. I'm a transportation planner for the city of Albany, and I'm going to share my screen right now and talk about it. Great. So, as you all may recall, in the active transportation plan of years past, 2012 and 2019, there was a vision for a north-south shared use path along the eastern side of I-80 between Buchanan Street and Cerrito Creek. Segment 1 of this path is complete and runs along the west side of the 500 block of Pierce, right by the towers on the west side of Albany Hill. Segment 2 includes a connection from the end of segment 1, the south side, along Pierce Street through Caltrans property and city-owned property, including Peggy Thompson Pierce Street Park, that is not complete. And then the development plans for the Saha Affordable Housing Project at the northeast corner of Washington Ave and Cleveland Ave include a path alignment that would bring the path along Cleveland Ave and eventually connect it to Buchanan Street. This is a much more simplified version explaining that and shows the very rough alignment of the path. The green lines are the existing path. Orange, yellow are the planned path that has already gone through design, and then the red segment is the proposed path, so that is the segment in question tonight. So the city staff have already are in the process of preparing an application for the MTC's Regional Measure 3 Safe Routes to Transit and Bay Trail Grant to cover a portion of the project's design and construction phase funding. Upon reviewing additional grant opportunities, staff has determined it's in the city's best interest to apply for a second county-based grant for the Bikeway connection project to close the funding gap. And this is through a grant called the 2026 Comprehensive Investment Plan, which is funded by Alameda CTC, or the Alameda County Transportation Commission. So that would bring us to having applied to 3 grants this year, at least this half of the year. The first grant that I participated in was the Keynes Adams Quick Build Bikeway project in June, and then we're proceeding with this MTC Regional Measure 3 grant, and this third grant would be a second grant to help to fund the Pierce Cleveland Bikeway project funded by Alameda CTC. So the staff recommendation is that the commission recommend that City Council authorize the city managers to submit a grant application for the Pierce Cleveland Bikeway Connection Project for the 2026 Comprehensive Investment Plan, and to enter into a funding agreement with Alameda CTC upon award of the grant. Staff recommends the City of Albany apply for this grant due to the project's strong alignment with the grant program's funding priorities. So firstly, the Bikeway is part of the Bay Trail Gap Closure Implementation Plan, underscoring its regional significance. The Bikeway will enhance connectivity on Alameda CTC's countywide bicycle network, and the Bikeway will benefit MTC designated equity priority communities in and around the city, all of which are explicit desires of the grant. And then outside of the grant, the reason that the city, this project has risen to the top of the city's list of priority projects is the recent loss of the AC Transit service along Pierce Street, the elevation and infrastructure barriers in the area, making it difficult to get around by bike or foot in that general area vicinity, the new affordable housing project that is in development and nearly done, and then the existing towers west of the Albany Hill that house a significant portion of the city's population. So we are seeking your approval to proceed with the grant application, and this was also an opportunity to remind you about the project.
Thank you. Does the commission have any questions?
I'll ask one. Do we have any data on traffic versus bicycle use on the existing one in front of the towers?
We haven't collected pedestrian counts for the existing. I mean, the existing one stops and you have to switch to the east side of the street. So I think it's currently mostly serving the parking along that stretch and the bus stops. But no, we haven't collected foot traffic data there.
Okay. That's all.
I would say what we have heard is a lot of complaints about using the sidewalks on Pierce Street and cars parked across it, and access around and over the hill to get over to the Buchanan and Solano areas. So I would think.
I mean, I know there's lots of cars that park well in front of Peggy Thompson's old house. They tend to park up on the.
I don't know where that is, but along Pierce Street across from the park, yeah.
Right, that's where it is. So this would be an alternative to people having to fight with cars on that sidewalk. I mean, it's reasonable.
The expectation is that this grant won't strain the city's capacity in any way for reporting purposes.
For what purpose?
Just like my understanding from talking to various people is that each grant has reporting requirements that add to the city's, workload, and that there are only so many grants that one can service at any given time. Just minor concern. It seems like a fairly straightforward process for this one, but
Yeah, we when we evaluate grants, we do take into account the funding source and the reporting or contracting requirements that come with it. Because of the slopes along this route, there is substantial grading, and it will be, there cost estimates we're working on now, but we expect it to be a substantial project because of that. So it's not one I think that we would be able to do with just our own funding.
Since you've opened up the topic,
No.
I've been given to understand from Bikeway that the ACTC call for grants involves an allocation of 3 grants per municipality. That's what I was told.
It's not an allocation of 3 grants, but we're allowed to submit up to 3 applications for the
Okay.
funding.
Yeah, it's a
I
limit.
only heard it how I heard it, you know. So you mentioned that you have been doing other granting actions or applications for grants. Is there a workload issue involved in not submitting additional applications to this call for funding? Or are there just not other projects that are ready?
I'll let Ben jump in as well, but I think it's a balance of both workload and limits on how much funding is available. So there's not a lot of funding in this Alameda CTC call. It's kind of a mid-plan update call. And so we expect both the MTC one and this one to be heavily applied for, heavily subscribed. So it's partly workload, but partly like we don't expect a lot of funding to be available to us, and so we think we're most competitive putting one ask in there. And they request you also to rank your applications. Those were the considerations.
Yeah, I can just say that we try and be judicious about which projects we apply for and which grants we apply for, and we want to make sure that we have a good shot at applying for the grants that we do apply for. So that takes some thinking, and we don't want to apply for every project, for every grant, willy-nilly.
Sure. Thank you for those additional details and helping explain your thinking on that to me. I obviously didn't have a very long conversation about this with Bikeway, but I understand it better now. Thank you.
Any further questions?
Well, when are we going to know?
Say that again.
When will we know?
Is it May?
I believe for Alameda CTC, it's next May. They will be waiting to see what the other 2 grants that Ben listed get awarded, and try to stretch their dollars as much as they can to make sure projects that are getting regional and state funding have the funding as part of their calculus. So that's our understanding on their timeline.
All right, shall we check for public comment?
If you're online and wish to speak on this item, please use the raise your hand feature. Not seeing a hand raised.
All right. Do we have any further discussion on this one? I think we kind of loaded it a bit into the questions section.
I'm sorry, I must have read this earlier when I read the document, but is this just a design grant, or is this a construction grant as well?
We're still settling exactly on what we ask from each, but the idea is that we would be looking for through construction funding between the two.
All right, well, if we don't have any further discussion, do we have a motion?
I'll move the staff recommendation. Second?
Commissioner Barnes,
Yes.
Commissioner Chomsky,
Yes.
Commissioner McCroskey,
Yes.
Commissioner Peng,
Yes.
Chair Vigil McClanahan.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, do we have any announcements?
Staff has a few announcements. One is an update on AC Transit Realign, which has been discussed at the commission a few times. There is a final realign plan going through the public hearing process. Staff reviewed it and found no major changes since the last time this was presented at the commission and council, and the the higher headways, lower frequency on the San Pablo lines are still first in line for increases within the, as we get additional operator resources list that sort of comes after what they have currently, and is, so those two things haven't changed since our last discussion and what's moving forward at this point. Next announcement is that the street tree management plan that I think got an intro presentation earlier to the commission on that from Community Development Director Jeff Bond is going to be coming back to the Parks Rec Open Space Commission at their next meeting, October 10th. So that plan is progressing, and if commissioners are interested, there should be more substantive discussion at the next pros meeting. The active transportation plan is getting underway, and we will be rolling out a project website in the next couple of weeks to start providing initial information on, and have set the date for the kickoff community workshop open house for the date of the usual October commission meeting. So we're going to repurpose your October meeting date for that workshop. It'll be at the community center. We're trying to have a wide hours range to get as many people to drop in over that window as possible. We're gonna have it open 5:30 to 8 to try to get as many people to participate. And so it's not a formal commission meeting, but we encourage you to participate if you're able. And we'll be going through talking initial discussions on goals of the plan and looking at existing conditions and getting opportunities and constraint kind of feedback from the public at the meeting. And we'll share some of the analysis that's been underway as the consultants look at collisions, which the commission has looked at numerous times, as well as sort of the current facilities we have on the ground and the level of comfort or service on those. The other item, which is scheduling the November-December meeting date, barring additional feedback, I think I've heard from almost all the commissioners ready to set that date as the December 5th, first Thursday in December for our special meeting date, and cancel the usual November-December dates that conflict with holidays.
December 5th?
December 5th. Those are the staff announcements.
All right, well, that handily covers item 8 as well.
Are there other announcements from?
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to make one. The Albany Strollers and Rollers are celebrating 20 years of advocacy and service in Albany. And as folks who are involved in transportation and active transportation in Albany, you're all invited. It's this Sunday at Ocean View Park. see me afterwards if you still need an invitation. We'd love for you to show up. We'd just like you to register so we know who's coming and make sure we have enough of our food and giveaways.
You want to give a URL for folks online who may be interested?
I don't have a URL off the top of my head, I'm sorry. They can contact me at kenmccroskey@gmail.com.
Any other announcements? All right. Well, I will see some of you in October, and hopefully as many of you as possible in December. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Once you ask our staff, I don't remember the exact name.
Recording stopped.
Who's the consultant for the ATC?